It's NUFC Transfer Daily, and in today's episode we're going to be discussing a possible new centre-back target, confusion in the boardroom, the fixtures released, and some new contracts for youth team players. Let's get into it. Hello, welcome back to my YouTube channel, welcome back to another video. Thanks so much to everyone who's continued to support the channel. If you haven't already though, hit like and subscribe because it really does help as always. There's actually things to talk about on today's episode. I'm not just going to be discussing my opinions but actual news, which is quite something considering the last few days on the show. And we're going to start with a report that came last night of interest from Newcastle and tentative talks in Brighton defender Jan-Paul van Hekke, 25-year-old Dutch player, won their player of the season last year and is definitely an accomplished Premier League centre-half. I think he would absolutely be a very, very good upgrade on what Newcastle already have. In some ways, I do have questions about whether he fits the bill, similarly to the domestic issues that I've mentioned before, but also stylistically. I think Newcastle need somebody who isn't just good with the ball at his feet, and as you can see with these stats, 98th percentile for progressive passes, and good in the air, but does sort of lack behind in sort of defensive actions. I think that's a concern. Does he have the pace that's needed? It may not be slow, but I think Newcastle do need pace as a real factor in the centre back they go for. I think they need somebody with specific recovery pace. So Van Hekke, I don't think is for me really, and I don't envisage him as being a major target. There's a lot of interesting subplots to this. One, it's a second Brighton player, given that Newcastle are already in talks and looking to progress on a deal with João Pedro. And Van Hekke is a player that João Pedro had that bust-up with at the end of last season, which has kind of paved the way for his exit from Brighton, and also the player that Anthony Gordon was sent off for that sort of arm in the face of in the FA Cup as well. That isn't necessarily a deal breaker for it. We've seen before that they sign players when they've had bust-ups with players. Think back to Anthony Gordon, that social media content they brought out when he signed of him meeting up with the players that he'd had that big bust-up with when he was at Everton. So I wouldn't necessarily say that's a deal breaker, but it's puzzling in the sense that the reason why João Pedro particularly is looking like he's likely to move away from Brighton is partly down to this bust-up with Van Hekke. And what would Brighton want from him? As I say, player of the season last year, there's a valuation of around 27 million that I read, and I think that would be very, very, very low. A great deal if it was possible, but I think it's unlikely to be that. Brighton are built as a club that looks to make as much profit as they possibly can. That's the whole point of what they do, and they're trying to do that with João Pedro. We're seeing that with £60 million. Similarly to the discussions we've had in the last week or two, I don't think the value that Van Hekke would actually command from a Brighton perspective would be conducive to what Newcastle are looking to get out of a defender, especially when he's not the ideal profile in terms of pace, physicality. He's more of a ball-playing defender. He's tall and he's good in the air and everything like that, but is he a physical specimen? I think, yes, he's good with the ball at his feet. That's obviously important for Eddie Howe, but to me, this doesn't quite fit and quite add up. So I wouldn't be surprised if it doesn't really come to fruition. Let me know in the comment section below whether you think Van Hekke would be an ideal signing, a good signing. Forget all the stuff around him, because I think that I don't think that would actually have much of an impact. But it is very, very interesting, particularly with João Pedro, if they bring both the players that were caught having a bit of a bust-up towards the end of last season. Next thing we're going to discuss is a little bit of boardroom confusion with reports. Paul Mitchell was going to leave early from his role. He's going to step down as director of football officially on June 30th, but he was actually going to apparently do it immediately. That was then rebuffed by the club, and the club have actually confirmed to me off the record that he is going to stay in place until June 30th. And there's been lots of talk about how much of a mess this is, whether all that confusion, whether it's going to have an impact, whether agents have apparently still been told that Steve Nixon and Andy Howe are the point of contact rather than Paul Mitchell. So what's the point in Paul Mitchell being there? I don't really want to get into any of that. I don't really know the ins and outs, so I don't really want to comment on it. But what I will say is that I think optically it's not great, because the club is in a situation where you guys are already split a little bit on how little or much business Newcastle need to be doing at this stage of the window. I wrote a piece for BBC Sport website, by the way, yesterday, which I didn't advertise yesterday, which explains kind of what their thought process is. Obviously, Eddie Howe has said that he wants dynamism and quick and quick action in the window. They have held talks, they have pushed for players, but there's a bit of an issue with that going on. Optically, as I say, when you consider that off the back of 3 windows without a signing and so much difficulty getting a settled board with the CEO going to leave in Darren Eales, there's no replacement been found there. As I said the other day, it's important that whoever is the CEO has enough power in the UK to make quick decisions, because if decisions are going back to Riyadh, that's kind of also impacting the pace and speed in which Newcastle are acting. It doesn't give off the feeling of everything being under control. I don't think it is by any means a crisis. I think Eddie Howe, working with Andy Howe and Steve Nixon, the targets are already looked at and the targets are already in place. The process is already underway to try and acquire them. I don't think that's too much of an issue, but again, for fans' nerves, for the optics of it's not ideal. Fans need to be confident that they know that the club is heading in the right direction. There's so much off the field that's not going well at the moment in terms of reports coming out of different things. They need a bit more certainty, and this isn't great for that. Will it make any difference? As I said in my Paul Mitchell reaction initially, the way forward is kind of already in place. They're looking at potential other replacements. I think that the new director will not be a sporting director, will be more of a technical director who work more in conjunction with Eddie Howe, not giving his ideas, more in working to what Eddie Howe wants. I think that is more likely what will happen. Whether Paul Mitchell should still be in place now, why he hasn't just left immediately, doesn't really make sense, other than maybe the fact that he's just going to be doing negotiations and leading talks until he leaves. But yeah, very strange sort of developments over the last 24 hours or so. He is in place. He will remain in place. But Andy Howe and Steve Nixon are naturally taking a more forthright role because they are going to be the ones who are going to be the port of call going forward. So I think there needs to be a little bit more clarity on the club side. And as I said earlier, I think that whoever is in place, whoever is in charge, needs a little bit more power to make actual decisions from the UK, so things are done a little bit quicker. But let me know what you think in the comment section. Maybe I'm overreacting, maybe I'm making something out of nothing, but I don't know. I think that this just needs a little bit more clarity. Youth players Sean Neave, Trevor Sanusi and Leo Shahar have signed new contracts at the club, which is a really, really positive thing. Sean Neave's really highly rated. I think he scored 13 goals in the under-19s or under-18s a couple of seasons ago. Obviously very much prominent in the first team picture, on the bench a lot last season, got a cup final squad appearance as well, so got a medal for that. Very, very highly rated, lots of high hopes for him. I think the Louis Miley emergence, partly out of necessity from the injury problems a couple of years ago, has maybe distorted the idea of what's going to happen with youth players and how much of an opportunity they're going to get and how ready they are. I'm not sure you'll see any of these 3 players regularly playing first team minutes next season. However, having said that, obviously with Champions League football and the Cups coming up, there's an opportunity there for more of that. But very, very exciting news about Sean Neave. Trevor Sanusi we saw in the Seller Cup, and I waxed lyrical in my vlog about him, particularly that first game against Girona when he was very, very lively on the Friday night. And Shahar's a very, very exciting defender as well. So big future, and the importance of the academy is huge in a UEFA era where it's more about homegrown players, and PSR when you need to create wealth and either sell players for pure profit or save money on signings by producing your own quality. It's really not possible to thrive as a club in this modern age without a very strong academy. And the fact that these 3 players have such bright futures, on top of Louis Miley, on top of Elliot Anderson coming, obviously there's evidence of how use of the academy can help with PSR in a sort of quite sad way, but it got Newcastle out of a hole last year. But these 3 players have huge hopes on their shoulders, and I think particularly from what I've seen, Sanusi is a really exciting player. Sean Neave has big hopes as well, and Shahar's played a lot of games for the England youth ranks as well. So we'll see how these players develop, but I wouldn't expect too much from them in the next year or 2. I think the Louis Miley situation, because that was out of necessity and because he is so highly rated, I think he is sort of seen as a generational talent within the academy ranks. That sort of pushed him forward a little bit. Hopefully people don't view the other players through the lens that he's been judged upon. And of course, I'm just going to give a little quick reaction to the fixture announcement this morning. Newcastle start the season against Aston Villa away, which is really difficult. Then they play Liverpool at home, and then Leeds away. So that's quite a difficult start. I still think, though, Newcastle will go into that confident. Obviously, context will be very, very different by the time. Hopefully, there'll be 3 or 4 signings fully bedded in. There'll be an opportunity that Eddie Howe will know his strongest team, which I think that was the issue at the start of last season. There was so much difficulty hanging over him. There was no signings. There was no real clarity on a lot of things. His future had been in doubt across the summer. I think hopefully Newcastle can go into this season with a lot more certainty with new players in, and that can help them bed in. But it's a really difficult start. Villa, obviously, how will they react to missing out on the Champions League? And they're expected to have a difficult summer. Maybe it's an ideal time to play them. But for me, I think what's important is there's lots of opportunity for good runs across the season. And as we saw last season, Newcastle were 12th in December and went on a 9-game winning run, put themselves in the top 4 race, and then never really went away from that. Again, in that second half of the season after the cup final, going on that fantastic run to drive it home as well. So that's a characteristic of this Eddie Howe team, is that when they get momentum, they seldom let it go, and they're very, very hard to stop when they get going on those sort of great runs. And I think the consistency that they show will help them have a good season, regardless of when they play certain games and who they play at certain times. The one thing that is slightly difficult, though, is after Champions League games, there's an away game against Sunderland in December, which is just after a Champions League game. So depending on what that fixture is and where Newcastle are playing, if they're away at Bodo Glimt or Olympiacos, that is probably not ideal. If it's a home game that Newcastle have won and they can take momentum into it, that's a lot better. But I don't think Newcastle should fear anybody, and for me, I don't really like analysing fixtures too much because everybody plays each other twice and there's only so much you can say about them. But it is a difficult start, but I wouldn't fear too much. There's plenty of positivity to get your teeth into before then. Hopefully the picture will look very, very bright by the time Newcastle are making that trip to Villa Park in mid-August. Thanks so much for joining me on this latest episode of NUFC Transfer Daily. I'll be back tomorrow with another one, and I'll see you then. Cheers.